Today, as we shift into different types of policy that the government makes and different ways that liberals and conservatives feel about the policy, we're going to start with the federal budget. We're going to talk about the federal budget process, and we're going to talk about the different forms of revenue and expenditures and all of that are included in the federal budget. Here we have President Clinton in 1998 and 1999. This is rare. This is the only time this has happened after World War II. But this is the rare window of time where the United States was actually in what we call a budget surplus. The government actually made more money each year than it spent because of a tremendous amount of spending cuts under President Clinton's administration. So we're going to talk about how budgets work and if this was a good thing for the country or not. Today's objective is a lot like just the policy-making process, but we're just going to focus on the budget-making process. So we're going to look at the different steps here, and same thing, we're going to be able to eventually explain how the different ideologies influence public policy making. So today we'll focus on answering the question, how is the federal budget made? All right, before we get too far into it, let's just make sure that we are all on the same page about a few basic ideas about the federal budget. So we're just going to run through some quick vocab here and make sure we understand how some of this stuff works. Who we have in the picture here, this is Mick Mulvaney. This was one of President Trump's heads of the Office of Management and Budget. So hopefully that's an office you remember from way back when we were going through the bureaucracy. We'll talk about the impact that they have on the federal budget. All right, so here's our most basic features of the budget. First of all, we've got revenue. When we're talking about the government's revenue, this is the money that the government brings in. Almost all of this comes through taxation, but this can happen in other sources like, trade, exports, things like that. But revenue is the money that the government brings in. Expenditures is the money that the government spends. This covers all of its programs and policies. So anything that the government is spending money on would be considered an expenditure. We're going to get into way more details on the different expenditures of the government. The budget is just their plan. It's an estimation of the taxing and spending that will take place usually for a year. This is called a fiscal year. The government doesn't always do this exactly the way they're supposed to, so it's just kind of for a period of time they estimate the revenue that will be coming in and the expenditures that will be going out, and the budget must be agreed to by the president and Congress. All right, and then there's a budget deficit. This is when the government spends more money than it makes. So it doesn't make enough money from taxes and it needs to borrow money to make ends meet. This is a lot, just a lot like you or me. Like I don't make enough money to pay for my house all at once. So I borrow in order to make ends meet for the year. The government does the same thing, right? So the government can borrow money in order to pay its bills all the time and continue to function. And when the government is spending more than it makes, we call that a deficit. And that requires the government to borrow money to function from day to day. The reverse is what we call a surplus. This is really rare for a government. The governments are tricky because they're not exactly like people. They're not exactly like businesses. If the government collects more revenue than it spends, we call that a budget surplus. That's what was going on at the very beginning with President Clinton. Surplus is tricky because if they collect more money than they spend, then you, the individual person living in the country, probably are going to feel like you're paying too much taxes, right? This is how they get their money. So when we have a budget surplus, even though that seems like the smart thing that you would want the government to do, it's not necessarily a popular thing that people like because each individual person, like even you guys, when you're getting your paychecks, you see the money coming out of your paycheck, you'd be upset if the government was taking more money from you than what they needed to run their programs. A balanced budget means that the government has collected enough revenue. This basically means that these things break even. A budget surplus would also be called a balanced budget, but this means that the government has enough money so that it does not need to borrow money that will add on to the national debt. And the national debt is all the money that the government owes because of all of its borrowing over the years. So because of all of the collective deficit spending from year to year to year to year, all that gets added up into what we call the national debt. This is the amount of money that the United States government owes different investors and different countries in the future for all of the money that they've borrowed. This is a crazy high, unimaginable number that we'll talk about a little more later, but this is all of the money over time. In recent years, the budget deficit in this country has been a few $1 trillion. So we are talking about an insane amount of money that the government owes to all of its different investors. And deficit spending, this is not much different than a budget deficit, but deficit spending just means that to function day to day, the government borrows money to pay for programs and policies. And we do this because in the United States, the people are obsessed with tax cuts. We do not tax the population much at all, definitely lower than other countries like us in the world. And so that's why the United States has usually, in order to function, has to borrow a tremendous amount of money because the public won't really tolerate paying the amount of taxes necessary to run all the government programs. All right, let's look first at the role of the executive branch in the budget process. So here's President Obama. He's talking about budget talks, meaning that he's been meeting with congressional leaders, and they've got to come to an agreement because that's the most important thing about the budget. Is the president and Congress must agree on how the money is going to be distributed across the government. So let's take a look at the president's role in this process. All right, so this little infographic helps us out with just a little bit of the process here. So we've got to make sure that we're always keeping in mind that this is a process that both the president and the House and the Senate must agree on. So we're going to go through all this stuff here, but the president is going to submit a budget to Congress, which really means like that's a proposal. That's the president showing Congress that that's what they want. And then it's up to the House and the Senate to actually write the budget. And this goes through that crazy long process we talked about, right? Like it's going to go to committees, it's going to end up going to conference committees, all this kind of stuff. And then finally, if the budget is agreed upon by the House and the Senate, it goes back to the president for the president to sign or reject and send back to them. So let's talk about the different parts of the executive branch's role in this process. Let's start with the people that actually do the work because Trump is not sitting around doing this math. Biden is not sitting around doing this. Obama is not sitting around doing this. We have a team of specialists that create the budget. And you remember the Office of Management and Budget. So the president, there's a law we'll get to later. The president has to send a budget proposal to Congress every February. And especially in the case of, like President Biden, he started work a month ago and he's pretty busy dealing with the COVID pandemic and all sorts of other things. So this is why the OMB handles most of this process. They're going to ask all of the other federal agencies for their request. The agencies are going to have to say, like, here's the amount that we've used over the last year. Here's our goals and what else we might need. And they're going to request that to OMB. OMB, they work with the president every day. They're going to have some idea of what the president's priorities are. And so they're going to create the actual math of a budget proposal. So they're going to write a budget proposal that the president will use to give to Congress. So the budget proposal that comes from the OMB, that's what the president is going to send to Congress. Congress makes the real decisions about the budget, but they don't have a total freedom either. But the president is giving Congress a list of things that they want. They're saying these are where my spending priorities are. I want to spend more money on this area of policy, and I want to spend less money in this place, or I want to, raise the taxes in this way, or whatever else. So the president is suggesting their plans for the budget. The president is also it's necessary that the president approve the final version of the budget at the end of the process. So when Congress is actually writing the budget, they have to use the president's proposals. Like they don't have to stick to exactly what the president said, but they have to keep that in mind because they know that it's necessary for the president to agree to their budget proposal. So Congress has to keep in mind that they need the president to agree so they don't stray too far from what it was that the president suggested. At the end of the process, when Congress has completed their side of things, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's up to the president to sign. So the president will go through, the budget that Congress has produced and make sure that it meets their same priorities, all the things that the president asked for, and that they are expecting to not get everything they want, but they want to make sure that it's not wildly far away from what they suggested. And then when the president has signed all of the bills, the budget and all the spending bills, this budget process is complete. Now, this is supposed to be a process that starts every year in February and ends every year in October. And so we'll get to all that stuff later, but that's kind of how this works. That's how president and Congress agree to a year-long budget. So that's the president's side of things. Let's go over to the legislative branch and take a look at all the ways that they influence the budget.